Hello everyone. Thank you for attending this paper presentation on the representation of grid forming virtual oscillator controller dynamics with WECC generic models. My name is Deepak Ramsubramanian and myself and my colleague Evangelos Farantatos have co-authored this paper and I will be presenting the same today. So with more inverter-based resources coming into the system, and especially they being connected to weaker portions of the network and a general reduction in short circuit strength of the network, there are newer inverter controls that are being developed both in research and by manufacturers alike. And these controls have been labeled as grid forming controls. And they have a tendency to be more stable to system variations, especially with highly sensitive voltage to current injection. But at the same time, there are no generic models that are presently available that transmission planners can use to represent the behavior of these grid forming controls when they are studying future networks. It's all well and fine once a system has been our inverter-based resource system has been commissioned and there is an inverter-based resource manufacturer who's known to provide the models. But in a futuristic case, and even in a scenario where there is black box models, generic models play a huge role, and presently there are no such generic models to represent the behavior of these grid forming controls. Now, what we've done is by utilizing conceptual similarities between the operation of a phase lock loop and operation of virtual oscillators, we see that there can be a potential to use some of the existing WECC generic models that have been used to represent conventional inverter-based resources, utilize those existing WECC generic models to represent the behavior of these grid forming resources. So if you look at the structure of a virtual oscillator, which is shown here in the Antonov-Hopf form of oscillator, then essentially what the virtual oscillator does is it uses internal state variable feedback. So these states of V alpha and V beta, it uses this internal state variable feedback and essentially you have a reference voltage command and you can generate a sinusoidal wave by V alpha, V beta at a certain frequency, and you have an angle for the sine wave. So this virtual oscillator where you set the frequency with omega naught and this you control the voltage, if one looks at it closely, one sees a form of a voltage control loop which is present here on the left hand side, where essentially you take the reference voltage square and then you compare it with the square of the V alpha square plus V beta square, which is essentially V magnitude square. So we see a voltage magnitude control loop being present here, and you see a form of a state variable with omega and this aspect here. We can transform that into the common PLL representation, wherein if you have your synchronous reference frame PLL and you have again the same factor of omega naught and the integrator to generate the angle, we can then add on an additional voltage control loop which has the same form of V reference square plus V alpha square plus beta square, and we can derive a sinusoidal wave. It's only that here, instead of using internal state variable feedback like the virtual oscillator, we would use an external output variable feedback to generate the sinusoidal wave. And in this form, it makes a conceptual sense because the PLL at the end of the day is a voltage controlled oscillator, which can hence generate these required waveforms. So with that kind of conceptual background, we see that we can now utilize some of the existing WECC generic models in positive sequence software, wherein the existing WECC generic models have this PLL kind of behavior. They have phase lock loops, they have voltage control loops, but we can parameterize them accordingly and we can get them to represent the behavior seen from the virtual oscillator control in EMT domain. Not just for three-phase faults, but also for load change events. There is some oscillatory behavior here, but in our subsequent work, we have been able to mitigate that by appropriately tuning the controls in positive sequence in order to get a much better match. So by utilizing these conceptual similarities between virtual oscillator and PLL, we can exploit this and make use of the existing WECC generic models for future studies, but future work will involve deriving relationships for the tuning rules of the parameters. With that, thank you very much for listening.